afternoon. I'm Kresta. I thought it'd be worthwhile going over this question of immigration again. There's a tremendous amount of confusion here, and as Teresa and I were pointing out earlier, you have to get the facts. If Time Magazine can't even get the facts, and the Washington Post has to criticize Time Magazine, you know full well that there's a lot of distortion there. So our moral outrage should be proportioned to the truth. What do we actually know? A few years ago, I published a commentary on immigration that began asking the question, do you know the mind of Christ on immigration? And I think the first response most people had to that commentary was, can I even know the mind of Christ on immigration? Well, if you mean, can you reliably know what piece of legislation Jesus would write to solve the immigration crisis, then the answer is no. But if you mean, does Jesus care about nations and immigrants, and has he revealed his priorities on this issue, I think the answer is yes. We can actually know a good bit. Now, we can't know, as a Catholic, we can't know the truth of these matters with the same dogmatic certainty that we can know about the nature of the Eucharist or the Trinity. But there are two immediate problems that Christians have when they come to this question of immigration that keeps the conversation from really developing. One of them is, many of them just quote a biblical passage like welcome the stranger and somehow think that settles the question of what policies the United States should enforce. The second problem that many Christians have is that they think that it's a purely secular matter, in that the church has no role to play in forming our minds on these prudential political matters. So let me say, first of all, this welcome the stranger idea is not nothing. All right, biblical Hebrew has 4 words that deal with the stranger, the alien, the immigrant, the foreigner, and this is why we need the teaching of the Catholic Church. Most of us aren't going to go out and, first of all, most of us are not going to go out and read the Old Testament and the New Testament to find all the passages that plausibly deal with immigration. And we're certainly not going to go learn biblical Hebrew and find out that there are 4 words that deal with the stranger, the immigrant, the alien, the foreigner. All right? So why don't we go then to the teaching authority of the Catholic Church on this? And they have integrated the church has integrated into its thinking this theme of welcoming the stranger. That's addressed, by the way, not first of all to the United States of America. That idea of welcoming the immigrant, the alien, the foreigner, is addressed to the covenant people of God. It's addressed to Israel and to the church, first of all. It's supposed to characterize our way of life so that the nations look upon the covenant people of God and they can see a better way of life. So let's keep that in mind. But here's what the Catechism actually writes on this question of welcoming the stranger. By the way, one of those words for stranger is related to the word enemy. So there are some foreigners, immigrants, aliens, who are not to be tolerated in the land. All right. Back to the Catechism says, 2241, the more prosperous nations are obliged, to the extent that they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of the security and the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his country of origin. Public authorities should see to it that this natural right is respected and that places a guest under the protection of those who receive him. So we can't just mock the welcome the stranger argument as though it's some sort of leftist propaganda. We're supposed to take all Scripture seriously. And what this means, in our case, it seems to me, is to ask, well, what is the Church getting at in this passage from the Catechism? It's raising the issue of rights. Is there a right to emigrate? And the Church says, yes, there is. There is a right to emigrate, but it's not an absolute right. It's qualified by a nation's responsibility to secure its borders and to assess the degree that it has sufficient generosity to absorb immigrants. In other words, these rights don't stand in direct opposition to one another. They modify one another. So yes, welcome the stranger, but at the same time, do you have the prosperity to do it? Are you securing your borders? Now, all of this neglect and nonsense that we see going on today, I think is partly because Catholics themselves don't understand what the Church teaches. I mean, you can go to, if the Pope gives an annual message on the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, you can get it very easily with a few keystrokes at the USCCB website or at the Vatican website. Or John Paul II, for instance. John Paul II came from Poland. Poland is one of the nations on the earth that had very insecure borders, all through the 20th century in particular. And just what John Paul II had to say in his Ecclesia in America, the Church in America must be a vigilant advocate defending against any unjust, keep that word in mind, unjust restriction on the natural rights of individual persons to move freely within their own nation and from one nation to another. Attention must be called to the rights of migrants and their families and to respect for their human dignity, even in cases of non-legal immigration. Migrants should be met with a hospitable and welcoming attitude which can encourage them to become part of the Church's life. Now notice, he's addressing the responsibility of the Church here. Now, John Paul II is familiar with the tradition of the covenant people of God, going back to the Old Testament, about welcoming the stranger. Just a little technical point here. Civil rights were provided for some of those foreigners in the law of Moses. They came under the same legal processes and they came under the same legal penalties as the children of Israel. They were to be treated politely. They were to be loved and treated generously if poor, and could even receive fruits of the harvest. They could receive sanctuary in times of trouble. A foreigner, however, could not take part in tribal deliberations. They could not become a king. And the prophet Ezekiel looked forward to a messianic age in where the immigrant, the foreigner, the alien would be able to share all the blessings of the land with God's own people. Notice the covenant people of God. I'm not talking about the United States of America here. He envisioned a coming kingdom without borders. But that's not the United States of America. Okay? The Church is that covenant kingdom that doesn't have borders, right? So the Catechism of the Catholic Church gives us, as citizens of America, and America is the lead nation in the world, the Catholic Church, Catholics in America, are supposed to help America remember what the kingdom of God looks like. It's not about imposing a law. It's about proposing a way of life. Now, welcoming the stranger should characterize the covenant people of God, and the covenant people of God should be able to show a way of life that the non-Christian American people can see as, wow, that leads to human flourishing. That leads to a better way of life. Now, that doesn't exist apart from the rule of law. This is why this whole conversation goes crazy. You have to have both. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has never supported the idea of open borders. Never. They believe that there should be a path to responsible permanent residency. They support family reunification policies. They continue to back the idea of refugees finding asylum in the United States. And they also want the United States to address the question of why people feel pushed out of their country of origin. What most people don't know is that the bishops also require payment of back taxes. They require a fine for breaking the law. They require people to go to the back of the immigration line, and they require a strong enforcement of the border. Unfortunately, the press has distorted the bishop's teaching on this, and every once in a while you get a bishop who speaks imprudently, just like we had last week when some bishop called for canonical penalties for those who separate families. I just wonder if he would call for canonical penalties for abortionists, for heaven's sake. Look, While the welcome the stranger theme is present, and it is expected of prosperous nations that can afford to be generous, at the same time, that is qualified by a nation's responsibility to protect its borders. St. Thomas Aquinas required consistent application of the rule of law as the primary proper means of coordinating civil society. You can't ignore the rule of law. Archbishop Chaput once wrote, "Illegal immigration is wrong and dangerous for everyone involved. There's nothing good about people risking their lives for the mere purpose of entering the United States. There's nothing good about our nation not knowing who crosses our borders and why they're here, especially in an age of terrorism, drugs, and organized violent crime. There's nothing good about people living in the shadows, or families being separated, or decent people being deported and having to start their lives all over again, sometimes in a country that they no longer or even never did know." End quote. The American people will never support comprehensive immigration reform without a believable commitment to secure the border. So you've got these two things going on here. You've got the welcome the stranger theme and America's generosity towards immigrants, but that will not grow if the American people are suspicious about securing the border. In other words, you have to have the rule of law before you get the generosity. So here's a few suggestions on what the church can do. Focusing on the church here. Number one, the church should welcome immigrants, legal or illegal, to come out of the shadows. We're not an arm of law enforcement. We're to help them come out of the shadows and then work with them, go and sin no more. So, 2, minister the sacraments, including penance. 3, exhort them to pay back taxes, get to the back of the immigration line, pay the necessary financial penalties. 4, make disciples of them. Give them sanctuary and promise to stand with them through the process of naturalization. Don't encourage them to stay in the darkness. 5, when appropriate, encourage them to turn state's evidence against what agribusinesses or factories or others who have lured them over here and held them in a form of indentured servitude. 6, insist that federal and state authorities stop trivializing the law by lack of enforcement. 7, if the state interferes with the legitimate ministry of the church, we must, and our bishops must, obey God rather than man. Catholics have much to say about welcoming the stranger, but also securing the border.